Strengthening the ground under the mind's feet. To conclude the material, we would like to go a little further in strengthening the ground under the mind's feet. There is so much in transurfing that seems incredible that one has to keep explaining to the mind that it is indeed all real. No matter the model chosen for transurfing, its principles remain valid. The core principle is simple. Our thoughts have a direct impact on our reality. While science hasn't fully proven this yet, we don't need to wait for validation. Regardless, you and I need to solve our problems right now and cannot wait for the scientists to give their word of approval. We know that everything in the world follows the law of cause and effect, where every effect has a cause. Usually, cause is seen as action. However, thoughts are often only viewed as instructions for action, not as energy that directly affect the world. Still, the facts remain, and eventually, they prove themselves. Science has not completely ignored the concept of outer intention. Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychologist, researched how thoughts interact with the material world. He studied many unusual events that seemed like coincidences without an obvious cause. Jung called these coincidences synchronicity. In his lecture on synchronicity, he shares a classic example from his own work. On April 1st, 1949, I made a note in the morning of an inscription containing a figure that was half man and half fish. There was fish for lunch. In the conversation, someone mentioned the custom of making an April fish of someone. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine whom I had not seen for several months showed me some impressive pictures of fish. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with sea monsters and fish in it. The following morning, I saw a former patient who was visiting me for the first time in 10 years. She had dreamed of a large fish the night before. A few months later, when I was using this series in a larger work and had just finished writing it down, I walked to a spot by the lake in front of the house where I had already been several times that morning. This time, a fish about a foot long lay on the sea wall. I had no idea how it could have gotten there. We cannot resist citing another extract from Carl Jung's lecture about the principle you will learn more about later. Jung writes, "I could tell you a great many such stories which are in principle no more surprising or incredible than the irrefutable results arrived at by Rhine," with reference to experiments involving extrasensory perception, like car guessing. And you would soon see that almost every case calls for its own explanation. But the causal explanation, the only possible one from the standpoint of natural science, breaks down to the psychic relativization of space and time, which together form the indispensable premise for cause and effect relationships. My example concerns a young woman patient who, in spite of efforts made on both sides, proved to be psychologically inaccessible. The difficulty lay in the fact that she always knew better about everything. Her excellent education had provided her with a weapon ideally suited to this purpose, namely a highly polished Cartesian rationalism with an impeccably geometrical idea of reality. After several fruitless attempts to sweeten her rationalism with a somewhat more human understanding, I had to confine myself to the hope that something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself. Well, I was sitting opposite her one day with my back to the window, listening to her flow of rhetoric. She had an impressive dream the night before in which someone had given her a golden scarab, a costly piece of jewelry. While she was still telling me this dream, I heard something behind me gently tapping on the window. I turned around and saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in an obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed to me very strange. I opened the window immediately and caught the creature in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabid beetle, or common rose chafer, Setonia aurata, whose gold-green color most nearly represents that of a golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patient with the words, "Here is your golden scarab." This experience punctured the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. The treatment could now be continued with satisfactory results. There are many similar examples. From a transurfing perspective, it's clear that in some cases, visualizing something can create a strong burst of outer intention. However, Jung didn't jump to conclusions about why these coincidences happen. He was unsure whether thoughts caused the events or if thoughts came from a subconscious premonition of the events. Jung suggested that thoughts create the foundation for a series of chance events, but also considered a certain premonition of the onset of a series of specific events. In his work, Synchronicity, a causal connecting principle, written in 1960, Jung defines synchronicity as, and this is a mouthful and I don't expect anyone to get it in first passing, but the simultaneous occurrence of a certain psychic state with one or more external events which appear as meaningful parallels to the momentary subjective state. Jung hesitated for a long time about whether to publish his work because the phenomenon of synchronicity was inconceivable to traditional scientific thinking. Jung makes a vague and yet, according to the standards of traditional science, relatively bold conclusion. Synchronistic phenomenon prove the simultaneous occurrence of meaningful equivalences in heterogeneous, causally unrelated processes. In other words, they prove that a content perceived by an observer can, at the same time, be represented by an outside event without any causal connection. From this, it follows that either the psyche cannot be localized in space, or that space is relative to the psyche. There's no contradiction with the laws of causality in what Jung describes. Every event has a cause, but the way thoughts and the environment interact is still unclear. In synchronistic events, it's unclear if thoughts shape the events or if thoughts are the premonition of what's about to happen. From a transurfing perspective, both explanations are possible. The heart connects to the information field and sends data to the mind, which then form thoughts. When the heart and mind work together, these thoughts can shape reality. This is the core idea of transurfing. However, the transurfing model doesn't aim to explain everything about the world. Instead, it's a tool to understand certain principles. We don't know everything about the world, but that doesn't stop us from using transurfing. The effectiveness of these principles is for you to experience. All phenomena related to the impact thought energy has on the surrounding world can be substantiated by the well-known theorem put forth by the quantum physicist John Bell. The theorem sounds like this. There are no isolated systems. Every particle in the universe is an instantaneous connection with every other particle. The entire system, even if its parts are separated by huge distances, work as a unified system. This theorem has been theoretically proven and is already substantiated on a practical level. Despite the fact that instantaneous connection contradicts the special theory of relativity, which claims that energy cannot move faster than light, the theorem still has its place. It would seem that outer intention fails to conform to the theory of relativity. In general, quantum physics is all based on unproven postulates, which means that it too represents a specific kind of model. And there's not just one inexplicable contradiction in the world of quantum physics, but many, which, once again, confirms that undue significance should not be attached to any one particular model. It should also be noted that Jung's ideas have found support among the very founders of modern physics, such as Wolfgang Pauli and Albert Einstein. In addition, it is quite probable that the process of information exchange does not have anything to do with energy at all, which is why it can take place faster than the speed of light. The alternatives model has its contradictions, but it helps explain some of the aspects of reality. While it may not fully solve all the paradoxes of time and space, it does clear up some of the confusion. We've been looking at how lifelines shift in sync with time, meaning lifelines exist alongside the timeline. Each transition happens from one point in time to another at the same point. Imagine two lifelines that aren't parallel to the time axis. If you project the same point from each line onto the time axis, the points will appear in different places. The transition between them would show a shift in time either to the past or the future, depending on the angle of the lines. The steeper the angle, the greater the time difference between the points. If two lifelines aren't parallel to the space axis, transitioning between them would happen instantaneously or at an extremely high speed. The angle and the direction of the lines would determine the distance and the direction of the shift. This is a simplified explanation, but it works within the context. The maker might be familiar with a popular or common paradox of time travel, such as going back and killing your parents before you were born, which may seem confusing, but within the alternatives model, it's not really a problem. If you interfere with one lifeline, you simply shift to a different one. There are, of course, infinite lifelines where you exist in some and don't in others. If you went back and met yourself, you'd be meeting a version of yourself from a different lifeline, not your original self. This scenario is just one of many possible alternatives. The past is unchangeable because it has already occurred as part of the realized lifeline, and the future is similarly already set in motion with all potential lifeline alternatives existing. Cause and effect will remain intact when shifting between lifelines, as changing one life doesn't affect another, similar to removing one frame from a film roll. Time itself is static. True change happens through the realization of lifeline alternatives, like a beam of light moving across the trees in a dark forest. It is possible to travel into the past or the future within the same lifeline, but this creates a paradox. This is why clairvoyance predictions are often only approximate or inaccurate. Clairvoyance can scan fragments of the future, but if these fragments belong to other lifelines, the error becomes clear. According to the alternatives model, the further apart two lifelines are, the greater the difference in their scenery. Scientists are puzzled by the UFO movement as they accelerate instantly, stop on a dime, or change direction sharply at high speeds, which should cause extreme stress to any passengers. From a transurfing perspective, this isn't supernatural. Aliens don't experience stress because UFOs aren't flying like planes. Instead, it's likely that we're observing the UFO being realized at different points in the alternatives space. A lot is still unclear about the relationship between the heart and mind. Traditional science views the world as a mechanical system where matter shapes consciousness. However, with recent scientific advancements, this view is losing credibility. Scientific models will continue to evolve as humanity mistakenly believes it can fully understand the laws of nature. Just like a hen could only understand the basics of a poultry farm, humans are a step ahead in intellect, but still far from comprehending the full complexity of the world. We are not meant to understand everything. The pendulums of science and religion claim to hold the truth, but they gain their power not through correct understanding, but by silencing those who disagreed. There is constant conflict not just between science and religion, but also within each of their own branches. This ongoing battle is not for the truth, but for followers. When we discuss the mind's inability to store all information, we use the computer byte model as an example. But this may not be compatible with how the brain actually works. No one knows for sure how the information is accessed by the brain. Imagine if a scientist tried to study a television or a radio before they were invented. They would press buttons, take parts apart, and watch the screen, but without understanding how the device actually works. Their conclusions might be that the TV creates all its own programs right from the components itself. This is roughly how adherents of the mechanistic model explore the human brain. Adherents study the human brain by observing how damage to certain areas affects perception and cognition. However, the true function of the human brain remains a mystery. Despite this, they insist that matter alone determines consciousness. These self-proclaimed scientists proudly claim their work is based on facts, rejecting anything that doesn't fit their theory as anti-scientific. Thankfully, this type of thinking is becoming less and less common. You may agree or disagree with what's in this material, but remember, it's just a model. No one knows for sure how things truly work. The mind rejects anything that doesn't fit its understanding. Until the mind accepts a concept as rational, it won't integrate it into your worldview. Transurfing works, but the mind needs an explanation to apply it. The alternatives model gives us the benefit of some solid ground beneath our feet, but no more than that. At the end of the day, it remains nothing more than a diagram that can be transformed into a more sophisticated or simplified model, depending on which way you want to go. For example, you could get rid of the assumption that so-called lifelines exist, which would make the earlier part of the material easier to understand. This would transform the alt space from discrete to continuous. There would no longer be any paths through the forest, only the forest would remain. Yet, this would not change the essence of transurfing. No matter what the model is, it could only ever provide an approximate, more or less adequate reflection of reality. The path of studying reality is as eternal as the diversity of natural phenomena is infinite. You may have noticed that transurfing shares principles with other teachings. This is normal as each teaching is its own model. Since we all share similar worldviews, different models will have common elements. Asking which model best describes the world doesn't matter. What truly matters is the practical results you can achieve from using any given model. Take mathematics, for example. Different branches like analytical geometry or differential calculus offer different ways to solve problems. There's no point in arguing which is better, it's about choosing the method that works best for you. Similarly, you must choose the approach that suits your life.